So pleasure, great having everyone. Welcome. My name is Dustin Robinson. I'll be your moderator for this panel on how to draft a successful application for Florida marijuana application round. I'm the founding partner of Mr. Cannabis Law, which is a full service law firm, and we've done dozens of applications in various states for various clients. But Florida is actually quite unique and mainly in two different ways. Number one is that if the Cannabis Lab could go on mute, please. Thank you. Florida is distinct in two different ways mainly. So number one is that the structure in Florida is vertically integrated. So on your application, you have to demonstrate that you're capable of growing, processing, dispensing, and delivering. Really, no other state has that requirement other than Florida. The second thing is that there's no cap on the amount of locations you can open up. So you really need to demonstrate on your application that you have a very robust real estate infrastructure. Those are very two complicated parts. This makes the applications very expensive, competitive, and complicated. But joining me today are two experts within the cannabis space that are going to provide legal advice on and hopefully bring some clarity to all this craziness. But before we get started, quick legal disclaimer. We're not providing legal advice, and viewing this does not create an attorney-client relationship. Also, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A box. We will get to them at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves and their experience around cannabis applications. Amanda, you want to go first?
Sure, absolutely. Hi, everybody. My name is Amanda Barton. I'm a partner with Mr. Cannabis Law. I also serve on the leadership team for Cannabis Lab. Thank you, Cannabis Lab, for co-hosting this event today. For those of you who don't know, Cannabis Lab is a networking and educational platform for those of us in the cannabis industry. It's actually how I got my start. I've been with Mr. Cannabis Law now for about 2 years. Before joining Mr. Cannabis Law, I was an attorney that focused primarily in the finance industry. So I was able to use my transactional experience in the alternative finance market to really leverage and help my clients in the cannabis industry. Focuses pretty much exclusively on the cannabis and psychedelic industry. So we bring all of our combined years of legal experience in advanced, complicated transactions, application work to those in the cannabis industry. So really helping our clients is something that we're extremely passionate about, along with the cannabis industry itself.
Darren? You are on mute. You want to drop yourself off mute, Darren?
Got it. How you doing? I'm Darren Potter. I'm a plant biologist by education. I've been in the cannabis sector for over 15 years, holding various roles as founder, board of director. I've founded a few companies in the cannabis sector, serial entrepreneur, going back since before 2010, in states like Colorado, Florida, of course, with the 7th license in the state of Florida. I've done applications in Florida, Arkansas, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, all over the country. Typically offering services as a subject matter expert in cultivation and operations primarily. And I'm a member of C-Lab and very happy to join you guys today.
All right. Well, before we jump into the details of the application, I think it's important that we provide a little bit of an overview of what's actually in the application. It's quite extensive and there's a lot of things that they're asking for. So Amanda, could you just kind of run through a quick summary of some of the different sections that applicants will see in the application?
Yeah, so to start with, they ask for some general background information. They want to show proof that you got your fingerprinting done. They want to know who the owners are. In addition to just some typical, documentation you would expect to see in an application. There's also different sections where you have to supply written responses, and those include cultivation, processing, dispensing, plans for security and accountability, your ability to execute on all of your proposed plans. There's a section for your medical director, as well as your personnel. There's also a diversity plan section and a section regarding your certified financial statements and your available funding to make sure you're able to execute on your plan. The business ownership has its own dedicated section, which you disclose the different various owners, managers, and also how they plan to capitalize the business. And then finally, there's some acknowledgement forms along with some citrus preference documentation if you are able to meet that criteria for the citrus preference.
Thank you, Amanda. And one of the most important aspects of these applications that's often overlooked is the scoring rubric. It's very, very important for any applicants to pay very, very close attention to how each section is going to be scored. So Darren, can you give us a little bit of an overview of the importance of the scoring rubric and maybe some pointers on how applicants could take a look at that scoring rubric?
Sure. And first, when you're talking about scoring rubric, I would differentiate that from those sections of the application that are required, so that if you do not have those sections filled out, you're automatically eliminated. So that you're going to be your Department of Revenue and your DOS documents as a registered business for 5 years, everything all the way down to your medical director documentation that states whether or not they've taken the 2-year continued education. So, first things, I'd probably put those first as your requirements, that if you do not have them, you will be disqualified. And then I would categorize everything by points. And, what I would recommend applicants to pay very close attention to is the score and the points of each category and subsection, as well as pay close attention to the key requirements and the language of those categories to understand how to achieve the best maximum points. So as an example, you can go to page 45 through 47 of the application rule, which clearly defines the sections, the raw points achievable for those sections, and the overall total weighted points for those sections. And that would probably be the best reference to understand the overall value of every single section.
Thanks, Darren. And the application is long, but in my opinion, it can be broken down into really 4 aspects that you really need to stay focused on. Number 1 is securing the real estate and the infrastructure. Number 2 is securing the human resources, so building your team. Number 3, demonstrating that you have a clear plan and the financial resources to execute on that plan. And then lastly, actually implementing a diversity plan, not simply having one, but actually implementing it. So I want to spend some time going through each of these items. Let's start first with what I believe is probably the biggest one, securing the real estate and infrastructure. This could potentially be very expensive depending on how you structure this. So Amanda and Darren, I'm going to open it up to both panelists. What are some of the important aspects of securing real estate and infrastructure? And what are some of the different ways applicants can be structuring these deals with potential landowners?
Amanda, feel free if you want.
Sure,
you want me to
I
go
can
first?
absolutely. Yeah, as Dustin mentioned, there are expensive ways to do it. You can actually physically go buy the land, and that's very cash intensive. You have to keep in mind that you can't get mortgages on, traditional mortgages on many of these properties, because for the federal banks, if you are operating a business that's considered illegal under the federal code, it is a violation of your mortgage. So you won't be able to get traditional mortgage financing. Another option is to take out leases, which is again expensive. One thing we've learned from Florida in the past is that these rounds take a long time. They're often peppered with litigation, which can go on for several years. So entering into a traditional commercial lease might not be your best option, because you might be stuck paying a lease without a license. And how are you that's really gonna drain your financial resources to keep several leases afloat when you're not even operational yet. A more strategic way to structure it would be to either have a exclusive option to buy or an exclusive option to lease a piece of property. So where you don't actually have to start leasing or purchasing the property until there's actually a license awarded to you. Sometimes those can be hard to find. You really got to work with real estate owners in order to do that. Another option is to bring a strategic real estate partner in on your team. Instead of paying them money for options, give them some equity. Add them to your team and give them equity in the applicant itself, so you're not coming out of cash on hand for those options.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, I would agree. Owning the property outright is obviously the best scenario, but that it speaks to your financial adequacy, but it is capital intensive. Lease agreements in place can be capitally intensive if you have to end up going through legal challenges, which we're very familiar that often occurs here in Florida. Simply an LOI is probably about the weakest you can have in an application and likely going to score low because it really doesn't speak to the secure of infrastructure, right? You really truly haven't secured it. You have a letter of intent to secure it should you get a license. So structuring deals with property owners, which can sometimes be very difficult, and you might have to bring them on as a partner, and then you have to take on the continued or the potential scrutiny of, will they meet the background checks, et cetera? Do they have any liens, liabilities? So these are all things to take into account when you're looking at securing infrastructure. And if you can afford it, or if you already have the property, that's always going to be the best case scenario.
Yeah, and you'll notice both Darren and Amanda are both referring to securing infrastructure, and that's the language that's used in the actual scoring rubric and in the application. So they want to see that you've secured this real estate. Obviously, the strongest security of a piece of real estate would be owning it. Next up would be leasing it. Obviously, a contingent lease is a little bit different, not fully secured, but you want to kind of balance fully securing the property with the idea of like, you might not get this license and you might not want to be tied into all this real estate. So I think a key aspect here, if you're looking to enter into leases on some of this property, is to understand that these applications, they will be scored, but there will, in my opinion, likely be lawsuits after. So it will take quite some time. So we've seen several situations in other states where people have entered into leases where they've had to pay something during this hold period. And then all of a sudden there's lawsuits, and 2 years later, they're basically paying to hold on to this real estate and they're actually not operating it. So very important that you kind of plan accordingly. Make sure you understand that this could take up to 18 to 24 months before you actually get your license. They'll likely score them in a shorter time frame, but with the lawsuits and everything, it could take up to 18 to 24 months. So when you're planning your real estate and your infrastructure, it's very important you keep that in mind. So I want to move on to the next point I have, the personnel. That was the second aspect that I think is very important. So first you have the real estate, second you have the personnel. What they want to see is that you have sufficient cannabis experience to successfully operate this license. So Amanda and Darren, what kind of personnel should applicants be looking to recruit, and what are some of the different ways of structuring deals with the personnel?
Go ahead, Darren. You can go first on this one.
Sure. So it's important to understand and realize that, when you're getting scored in these applications, you're going head to head with other applicants. Oftentimes, some of these applicants may have licenses in other states, so they have personnel with experience. So that's very important to understand when you're putting together your team. If you're fresh into this and you don't currently have licenses in other states, I would tell you that Florida experience probably helps the most due to the regulatory nature of the state. And I personally would look for, individuals with a minimum of 5 years experience in regard to cultivation, processing, and dispensing. You also want to make sure that those individuals have zero enforcement actions against them in other states, should they worked in other states or other regulatory, anything having to do with cannabis or outside of cannabis that's going to impact your personnel and your application scoring. I would also recommend, when you're looking at individuals for your application for personnel and their experience, you might also consider subject matter experts to act in the place of advisors. As an example, if you're not able to secure, that's going to likely score weaker if you don't have that personnel on staff or personnel in a pre-employment agreement, if you will. But those are things that you can look at in regards to making a robust team. You also might want to consider when you're hiring on, let's say, a cultivator or a processor, they may not be technically, they may not be the best technical writers. They may be very good at operations, but you may not want them writing those sections. You may want them working with a technical writer to write those sections to ensure that you get the highest points. So that would be my recommendation. And then structuring a deal, obviously, with the staff members, I'll touch on that. There's all kinds of ways to do that. There's everything from stock options, we like to call them golden handcuffs. There's also revenue share models that you can look at. Obviously, everybody has to be able to pass a level 2 background screening. That's wildly important. That can disqualify you if they do not pass that level 2 background screening. And everything from simply just competitive compensation. People are certainly in the job market this day and age. So if you offer a competitive comp, you're likely to find some pretty good candidates.
Yeah, I echo everything Darren said. It is, ideal to have somebody that already has experience in the cannabis market here in Florida. We have that online now since 2014, so there are some very, very good qualified individuals out there. If not out of state, you can definitely source people from out of state as well. But something to keep in mind is that how these applications are graded is by technical experts. So to Darren's point about, you might have a really great guy that's amazing at extraction. He might not be a great technical writer, but somebody who is a technical writer and understands the science behind it is going to be scoring that portion of the application. So it is very important that that knowledge from your experts does get translated into your plans as well. But yeah, key to have people on your team that have experience in the cannabis industry. They're looking for people, applicants that can be up and running very quickly. They're not looking for someone who's looking to learn on the way up. They want to see that you're ready to be operational and you have the best likelihood of success.
Yeah, and a couple just additional comments on my end. There's actually a section in the application that asks if any, not only if the owners or the applicant has had licenses that have been sanctioned in other states, but it also asks if any of the managers have been sanctioned in any of the other states. So what I recommend is any team members you have on your team, before signing anything with them, I'd recommend having them fill out that form to make sure that they haven't been a manager that has been at a licensee in another state that has had some sort of sanctions, because in the scoring rubric for that particular section, you automatically get put into the B score, not the A score, if any of your managers do have any of those sanctions. So I think it's important before you sign anything with anyone you bring on your team, make sure you collect the necessary information to make sure that they aren't going to kind of put you in a situation where you're getting dinged on points. Another comment I'll make just on the structuring, some applicants will bring in specific individuals. Others will do agreements with some other out-of-state MSOs. So this has been very popular. Obviously, if it's an out-of-state MSO, they have experience in cannabis, they have a whole team, they have SOPs. Of course, they haven't operated in Florida, so you'd have to address that in the application and explain how their out-of-state experience is applicable to the cannabis operations here in Florida. So, there's different ways you could kind of bring in just specific individuals and build out your team, or you could find an out-of-state MSO that is vertically integrated that could kind of check the box on all the cannabis experience. So let's move on to drafting a clear plan. So you're going to need a cultivation plan, processing plan, dispensing plan, security plan, and business plan. Sorry. Let's just start with the cultivation, processing, and retail plan, which are really the guts of your operational planning. What are the main scoring criteria relating to these operational plans, and how can applicants ensure the highest score on these plans? Darren, if you want to start out, since you're not on mute and Amanda is.
Yeah, sure. Each of these sections qualifies as the highest category of score. As an applicant, they can demonstrate their superior ability to cultivate, process, dispense. I would emphasize previous experience. Florida, as an example, previous experience would include such as low THC, which is a requirement for the applicant to produce and really needs to be their first product produced. How much you intend to produce and how that ties to your processing plan and the throughput of the equipment that you select and reflect and represent in your application is very important, and how that ties to your dispensing plan and your throughput through that store, as well as how it relates to the current market, right? You're not going to be a $10 million dispensary where no current dispensary in Florida is really doing $10 million a year revenue. So making sure that all ties together from seed to sale exactly is very important in how you represent that. Your cultivation plan, how you intend to acquire genetic seeds, grow those plants, whether it be in a greenhouse or an indoor, how you intend to ensure your crops are safe and clean and pesticide free within the regulatory requirements of the state, how they're going to be yeast mold mycotoxin free, so ensuring that they're going to meet all COA requirements and not zero concerns with yeast, mold, fungus, etc. So that's very important. And then from your processing standpoint, you have requirements for solvents and making sure that you're going to meet every single COA requirement to get those products to market. So as an example, with a gummy, making sure that you're at 10 milligrams and you're not at 10.1. That's, your formulations and how you achieve that. And speaking to that, and mind you, these sections, while the application is very long, it is a limited number of pages. So it's a lot of experience and information that you have to put in, your cultivation plan, as an example, 10 pages, your infrastructure, 7 pages. So, speaking to your infrastructure, right, you need to be able to show each and every area, your security plan, your overlays, your access control. So it's a lot of information, and it really needs to tie together, as well as the cost of that infrastructure and how you're going to represent that in your financial plan, and be able to represent that you can operate this business from seed to sale for a minimum of 2 years without really generating $1 before your application fee is due. So it's really important to pay attention to the language and the requirement of every single question asked in each section. That would be my best answer for that.
Yeah, and to add on that, what's interesting is when you look, right, there's big headings. So there's cultivation, like you mentioned, there's dispensing and processing, but they break it down. So for each of those, first it's the plan itself, and that's awarded 80 points. Then there's the infrastructure, which they want to know, like, what is your equipment? What is your infrastructure? What do you plan on it being? And then and that's 60 points. And then the third is the ability to secure infrastructure. So if you just write, I plan to get all this big equipment, and you have no ability or resources to secure it, you're going to, lose out on those points. So it's not just about what your plan is. You can have the best plan, but if you don't have the infrastructure plan to acquire the infrastructure, you're not going to score very high. And what's important to remember about all 3 of these sections is they are weighted 2.25%. So they're given additional weight. So it's not just the raw points, but they're actually, those scores are weighted. So they are very crucial to your application. And also, as Darren mentioned, it's not many pages. So I feel like they really wanted to kind of weed out all the fluff, and they really just want your meat and potatoes. So, as attorneys, we love to write, but, double spaced, it's, that's 10-page double space. So it's really like 5 pages. Not much room. You really got to be concise with your information.
Absolutely. And just to add on top of that, like Amanda mentioned, each of these sections, cultivation, processing, and retail, they're structured the same in that they want to see your plan. They want to see what you've actually secured and your ability to secure it. And what's interesting is they have one scorer that will kind of look at your plan and what you've actually secured. And then they'll actually have another person that reads all those sections to basically make sure that they're all consistent. And I think consistency is really important. You don't want to have a cultivation plan. There's a lot of templates going around, right? And it's not hard to get a cultivation template. But if you have a template that talks about growing in a greenhouse, but then when you talk about your infrastructure in the other section, you're talking about indoor growing, you're going to be dinged on points. And I see Darren smiling, and it sounds funny, but the reality is that there's a lot of templates floating around, and there's a lot of people that haven't drafted these applications. So it's very easy to kind of just drop a cultivation template, and then it's just not consistent with some of your other sections. So I'd be very careful to make sure that the infrastructure you're securing is also consistent with the plan that you're proposing in those sections. So let's move on to the security section. What are the main aspects that applicants need to be aware of for the security section?
Broken down into 5 sections. So there's premises security, IT security, diversion, unlawful access and transportation, personal and training, and recalls. And each of them are awarded a point. So each of them are equally as important. Now, obviously, security is a top concern here in Florida. They require gates and, points of access and restricted access. So really understanding the premise security along with the IT requirements are incredible. What's one thing, a lot of people didn't think about in the first round is how long you have to keep your video footage. So if you have this mammoth facility that has let's even say 10, 15, 20 cameras, you have to keep all that video footage for a certain amount of time, according to the OMMU. And the amount of actual I'm not a technical person, but I'm not an IT person, but the amount of like backup that you have to store that much video footage is incredible. So you really have to work with an IT specialist that can help you set up all your IT needs in order to be able to comply with all the rules.
Yeah, I would strongly advise bringing on a security expert and IT expert for this specific section. I certainly would not try to tackle it, as a cultivator or processor, dispenser, and operator. There's going to be multiple layers to your security, everything from camera and even specific camera selection for whether it be your perimeter or your interior. Everything from your IT infrastructure, your battery backup in the event of loss of power, right? And how long that battery can actually maintain those servers so that you don't lose for even a minute, right? Any of your visual of all the areas, right? Your badging, how you're going to badge and access people when you're restricted access into specific areas for operations, and who has those authorizations to go into those areas for everything from secured product to cultivation, processing, and all the way through dispensing and safes and dispensing, right? Access to cash. So those are all things you really need a specialist to come on board to ensure that you have the best plan moving forward. And I'll use an example, like mother rooms are often picked on by inspectors because you have tall plants in there, and they really want to make sure that they're able to catch every single aspect of the entire room, that no one can essentially hide behind a plant, right? So you really need to take strong consideration as to what you represent in your application, because you are going to have specialists reviewing this who already know these things, right? And that's why it's important to find the right people to write these sections.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of add on to that. As we're talking, all these different sections, they sound so technical. So it's like, cultivation, you really got to know cultivation. Processing, you got to know all these different extraction methods. And even for security, you really need someone that understands that. So I know there's a lot of consulting firms out there that are kind of drafting these, but as you could imagine, there's no one person who is an expert in cultivation, processing, retail, IT, all these different aspects. So I think it's important as you build your team, you also get these people on board to actually work with your application drafter on, the technical aspects to make sure that everyone's on the same page and that your drafter really is able to have the resources they need from a technical perspective for each of those sections. So I want to move on to the business plan. So the business plan is separate from the cultivation plan, processing plan, dispensing plan. I know a lot of people get confused. They're like, how is my cultivation, processing, and dispensing plan different than my business plan? So if the panelists, you guys could kind of talk a little bit about how the business plan differs from your cultivation, processing, and dispensing plan.
Sure, absolutely.
Go
ahead.
ahead.
No, you go first, Aaron. It's cool.
I was going to say, I think the first thing to recognize in the business plan is that it's only 5 pages. So if anybody's ever looked at a business plan, 5 pages is pretty lean for a business plan. And this is where you're reflecting essentially who you're going to be when you grow up. So you really need to articulate, all of those plans together for cultivation, processing, dispensing, and the phasing of your facility, your build out, and all the required capital to do so, and how it jives, how it works together. So this section is really about how it all ties together. And I would say, it's a very brief synopsis, only being 5 pages. So be mindful of, and as you said, double space. So be mindful of your selection of wording and how you're articulating it in this section.
Yeah, I don't think it's really, honestly, when you read what they put under what a business plan is, I really don't think it's a true business plan at all. It really is. They want to know what's your step-by-step from the moment that notice of award to the time you open up, your facility, step by step. How are you going to go from awardee to operational? It's how you put all of those plans in action. Are you taking a phased approach to your cultivation facility? Are you planning a delivery retail stores? Are you, how do you plan to implement your?
And we're having a little tough connection on Amanda's part, but we got the gist of it. Thank you, Amanda. And so just moving on to the diversity plan. So one of the things that I think is important to note on the diversity plan is that you score the highest if you're actually implementing your diversity plan, right? So once again, there's a lot of templates out there for just having a diversity plan, saying we're gonna, have a diverse workforce and whatnot. But if you really want to score in the highest category, you're gonna have to actually implement your diversity plan. So Amanda, maybe you could talk a little bit about what it means to actually start implementing your diversity plan.
Sure. If I cut out, I apologize. If my internet connection's a little unstable, just let me know. So yeah, everyone can say that they plan to hire minorities, right? It's what are you actually doing to show that you plan to enact your diversity plan? Are you going to be purchasing equipment from minority-owned business? Are you going to have vendors? What are you actually doing right now? Do you have minorities, women, veterans on your ownership? Are you doing training? Are are you certified as a minority-owned business? It's what you're doing today and what you're going to do immediately after getting an award. It's not what it's great. We all can write a great diversity plan, but how are you actually going to contribute?
Darren, anything to add on top of that?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say in regards to diversity, it's good business practice to have a diversity plan that you actually are implementing. When you think of the consumer market, say in a crass way, it's not a bunch of rich white people or white guys, consuming cannabis. You're gonna have all walks of life. So, you really need to consider African American, Asian American, Latin American, and women obviously classified as a minority. And I would say the cannabis industry does not reflect quite as much as it should a minority and diverse population within the business owners and the operators. So think of it everything from your board of directors all the way down to managers and your C-suite, not just your labor pool, right? And absolutely what you said, your vendors, who you're hiring as contractors, where you're getting your materials from. So I think, diversity plan shouldn't just be considered as a point scenario, and obviously it's part of the application, but it should be just part of good business practice, because you want a good perception and reflection of how your business operates. And certainly we have a diverse group of consumers, and that needs to be reflected on the business side as well.
Absolutely. And there's great resources out there to find minority owned businesses in Florida. So, everything from your vault to your processing equipment, whatever equipment or whatever vendors you're going to need. I think it's a good practice to use some of the resources online to find all the minority owned businesses, and you could enter into LOIs for the application, basically committing to buy these products and equipment from these particular minority owned businesses. So that's what it really means to be implementing it currently, to actually have contracts or LOIs in place upon submitting application that commit you to actually using some of these different vendors that might be minority owned or veteran owned or whatever it might be. One of the other big sections that I think also gets overlooked but has quite a bit of points allocated to it is your medical director. It's a large section that asks for a lot of different information for your medical director. And it also asks for kind of a backup plan if something were to happen to your medical director. So maybe potentially having a backup medical director. So Darren or Amanda, any kind of pointers on, what to look for with respect to a medical director and how to approach this section of the application?
Sure. Obviously your medical director is going to be required to have some background in prescribing and recommending. It would be great if they have a background in recommending cannabis. They also have the requirement of the 2-hour continued education. So if they've already completed that, that's a benefit. If they've been a previous medical director, that is, definitely beneficial, specifically for a cannabis operator. And it is important to know that, if you do not have a medical director, you have to have a backup plan. You are not permitted to dispense product if you don't have a medical director on staff. So oftentimes in applications, you'll see a backup medical director. That's very common. And, obviously you have to take into account the financial obligations when you do so. So, that would be what I would look at. Medical directors cannot be recommending physicians while they're currently, the medical director of an MMTC. So you take that into consideration, ensure that you have proper paperwork to ensure that medical director is not practicing anything like that. And obviously there's kickback concerns, and there's sections within the application to address those. So all of those things you're going to want to address with your medical director and make sure that they understand if they haven't served as a medical director for an MMTC, so they understand the obligation when they're signing up for this role.
Additionally, we've heard a lot of people that are interested in bringing in a medical doctor or a recommending doctor from another state. If they are not currently licensed to practice medicine in Florida, you're going to have an issue. They do need to be a Florida licensed doctor. So that's something to keep in mind as well.
Absolutely. And I have a bunch of other questions, but I want to make sure we have time for everyone to ask their questions. I already see some questions floating into the Q&A, and I'm sure we're going to have more coming in as we close this out. So my last question, and this is a very, very important aspect, is securing the necessary capital to execute on your plan. And what I'm referring to here isn't just the capital for drafting your application. There's certainly costs involved in that. The application fee just in of itself is $146,000, and you're going to have to hire attorneys, application drafters, and there's certainly going to be costs related to simply putting together this application. But what I'm referring to more is what you're demonstrating in the application as far as your access to additional capital. So section 4.4.4 asks about your ability to secure processing infrastructure. 4.5.3 asks about your ability to secure cultivation infrastructure. So I got those flip-flopped. And 4.6.3 asks about your ability to secure dispensing infrastructure. So in each of cultivation, processing, dispensing, they're asking about your ability. So what they're really asking there is about your funding ability. Where are these funds going to come from? And then in 4.12, they ask it more directly. They ask about your available funding and your projected budget. So they want to see that you're creating a budget that is consistent with your plan. You know, if you're going to have a 50,000 square foot facility built, you better make sure your budget includes that, and you better make sure that your available funds demonstrate that you could actually afford that. So, you know, how much capital should applicants kind of expect to be able to demonstrate they have access to? Obviously, it'll depend on their plan and their budget, so on and so forth. But what would you say is kind of like a minimum that you would need to have, make sure that you're able to demonstrate that you're able to execute on your application representations, and any advice as to how to actually secure that capital?
Amanda?
Sure. The OMMU does not set an exact number what they expect to see. Again, I think it's continuity with what you have in your plans. You know, like you mentioned, if you have this elaborate build out plan for your cultivation and processing facility, processing equipment is exceptionally expensive. You know, you have to show that you actually have budgeted for it and have the funds. So I think a lot has to do with your plans. Like if you already have built out this beautiful facility and already put millions into your facility, you might not need to show as much as if you are planning to do the build out. Also, you know, I think you'll get more points if you are showing money in the bank account. Like you have to submit a certified financial statement. So if you're showing you have 20 million in the bank, in the applicant's bank account, I think you're scoring higher than if you just have like an LOI from an investor or some kind of investment relationship set up. Not to say that having an investor isn't going to work. You just might not score as many points as if the money was already in the bank. As far as a number, I mean, just to throw some numbers out there, I mean, I think you're looking in excess of about 10 to $20 million. Like Darren mentioned earlier, you have to show that you can facilitate this thing for a couple of years without any profit. You know, the revenue isn't going to roll in for a couple of years. So you need to show that you can keep yourself afloat for 2 years while building out multiple locations, buying expensive equipment, and really rolling out just a huge, huge program.
Yeah. To add to that, you know, you need to remember the renewal fees, just a little over $1.3 million. So, you know, I would calculate that into my 2-year cost of running business without generating any revenue. I would certainly say that, you know, if you're in the 10 million range, you're probably on the lower end, 25 to 35, maybe you're in that mid-tier range. I would expect to see individuals or applicants in the realm of 25 to 35 for sure, all the way up to 100 million. And, you know, what you said is very important, reflecting a balance sheet or proof of funds of an individual who intends to, you have an LOI from an individual, that's going to be a lot weaker than having that capital in the entity that's the 5-year business registered with the Department of Revenue as an operator, as well as, a couple things to remember. You also have to be registered with FDEX as a nursery. So just throwing that out there as a little thing to remember. That's only $35. That's not gonna kill you. But if you cannot reflect that you have the capital to build the infrastructure, you're reflecting cultivation, processing, dispensing, and operate for 2 years without making a dime and cover that $1.3 million renewal fee, you're probably not going to be showing a strong application for this section or a strong section to get the highest amount of points. So I would definitely keep that in mind when you're looking at your overall plan. This may cause some people to scale down their plan. It doesn't say that you have to be the biggest company in the state, right? You do have to be growing in a very largely competitive market, and you have to do it very fast. You have 60 days to request cultivation authorization, 60 days to request processing authorization, and 60 to request dispensing. So it is a lot of work to do in a very short period of time. And if you have not secured cultivation premise and you have not begun work to actually, have your facility in place, should you get a license, I'll tell you right now, you're not going to build something in 60 days. It's just not feasible from, a logistics and material standpoint to get all of that in. Should you get a license, call the state and say, hey, we're ready in 60 days. If you haven't already done that work. So if you haven't, I would say start on it immediately. And then as for raising capital, a lot of that comes down to your business plan, who you reflect in your business plan, and, going to the right investors. I mean, Florida is probably one of the better spots to do so with the high net worth individuals in the state to raise that kind of capital for an application of this nature. It's certainly a very competitive application, and there's a high barrier of entry, right? High cost. So all of those things to be kept in mind.
Yeah, and just to add on top of that, you're going to have to submit certified and audited financials. So they're going to see your balance sheet. They're going to see how much cash is in the bank. And if you're submitting certified and audited financials that show zero in the bank, that's not going to look good. Ideally, I think best situation, you have cash in the bank, but you could also enter into lines of credit if you're able to show a proof of funds from a particular individual that, is willing to give you some large line of credit to get you through this. That's helpful. Obviously, if you have an investor with some sort of commitment that's going to fund this upon being licensed, that's also good. But it's very challenging. I mean, look, I'm sure some people are listening to this and they're hearing, $20 to $25 million. I don't think, they're issuing 22 licenses, right? And the person who wins first place and the person who wins 22nd place, they all just end up with a license, right? So there certainly will be people in that top tier that have tremendous amount of capital that they're going to be able to demonstrate. But I also think there's going to be people that are a little bit further back, maybe the 15 to 22, that maybe don't have as strong as funding sources as some of these others. So I wouldn't get too discouraged from the 10 to 20 million or 20 25 million, but you certainly want to demonstrate that you've thought it through and you have some sort of source that you can go to basically execute on your plan, which is very hard to do. Obviously, once you have a license, much easier to go out and raise 20 25 million dollars. But right now you're basically sitting here with no license, and you got to go out to investors and essentially try to find some sort of a commitment or some sort of line of credit or some sort of financing facility that could help you demonstrate this. And one of Amanda's points was very important as well. If you've already built out this whole infrastructure, right? If you got 5 built out retail stores and you got, a great cultivation facility that's turnkey, you got a processing facility that's turnkey, you're going to have to demonstrate less capital, certainly, but you're certainly going to have to demonstrate some capital because you're going to be operating at a loss for quite some time. Even if you have a turnkey operation ready to go, you're going to have to staff it up. You're going to have to pay people before you're starting to earn, actual revenues. So it's just going to take some time. So I certainly encourage people to try to really spend time figuring out what their funding source is going to be. So we are going to jump into the Q&A. We've got a whole bunch of them. So I will read them out and just go right through them. And if anyone has any other questions, just drop them in the Q&A box. So first question, is there a stipulation after approval stating there must be active cannabis cultivation within a certain period of time? I know Darren said 60. I know the rule is 64.005. I actually believe it's 75 unless it was changed. I believe it's 75 days after getting awarded, you have to demonstrate cultivation. And then there's also days you need to demonstrate processing and dispensing as well. I think dispensing is 200 days after being granted. But what's important is that the way that rule is worded, it's actually that what you need to do is you need to request cultivation authorization within 75 days. So it doesn't mean you need to get approval, right? So if you put in that request within 75 days, even if the department comes out and says, hey, you still need to do this, this, and this, you basically satisfied that condition. And a lot of the previous licensees, these 22 that are currently licensed, they played around with that wording quite a bit. And some, I'm sure most of the people on the call know that a lot of these guys didn't become operational from a cultivation perspective for a very, very long time. So they requested their cultivation authorization within that 75 day time frame, but they didn't necessarily satisfy it within that 75-day time frame. Any other comments from Amanda or Darren on that?
Yeah, I think what you, oh, go ahead.
No, go for it, Darren.
Yeah, I think what you said is important to understand. Requesting cultivation authorization within that time frame. For me, at Grow LT, it was 60 days, and I will say we met that requirement. We met all the benchmarks of the state. But it is important to understand that if you do not meet the benchmark, you could face an action by the state. I believe it was May of 22 when they actually created the emergency rule to rescind a license should a license not be performing within the renewal time frame. So, you do have a window, but if you want to stay in the best foot forward and the best relationship with the regulators, which is important to do, you do want to try to meet those requirements, and that's requesting authorization and going through the inspection and meetings. Should there be little changes and tweaks, not a big deal, but if you don't have any infrastructure, as an example, in place, certainly going to reflect poorly with the state and the inspectors.
And just something else to add for purposes of this conversation, more importantly, you need to demonstrate that you're able to get cultivation going in a relatively short period of time on your application, right? So once you actually get the license, this is the rule, 75 days. But if you go on your application and you say, hey, here's our cultivation plan, and we're not going to be ready for another 15 months, that's not going to score very well on the application. So I think from an application perspective, you need to be very, very clear in demonstrating that once you get this license, you're able to go and you're able to at least make a request for cultivation authorization in very short order. Next question we have on here. Can you expand on the initial disqualifications? Registered business for 5 years, ? Continuing education for 2 years. I'll just start off with the answer on that, and then you guys could jump in. But the main requirement right now is that the business needs to be registered for 5 years. There's also requirements, like Darren mentioned, that you need to get some permits through FDACS, the Florida Department of Agriculture, as well. Also, some of the felony stuff is in there. They got rid of that 30-year nursery requirement. My law firm, we still receive a lot of phone calls from people that love to ask about that 30-year nursery that was in the original statute. That's no longer in there, so you do not need to worry about that. But Darren, any other items that you want to kind of just talk about that are immediate disqualifications?
Yeah, and just make sure that you read and review the application rule, because it'll really clearly define that in those sections. So, as just as medical director, 2 years, that 2 years education applies directly to the medical director. And it's not that they have to have completed that 2 years, but there is a form for the medical director that needs to be filled out and included with the application. And if you don't fill out that form, you will be denied, right? They're not going to review your application. So there's certain things that you absolutely have to have for them to even review your application. So I would just make sure to thoroughly go through that application rule. And that's why I say when I'm doing an application, I kind of look at things from I absolutely have to have, if I don't have this, I'm not even being graded, to what's my highest points. And I kind of break it down that way. So that's the way I would approach it. And it's pretty clearly defined in the application rule. So you can see those, it'll say, application denial as an example.
Yeah, and there's actually the application scoring is broken into first 3 phases, and that first phase is simply ensuring that you have all the minimum requirements and that you've submitted everything. So the first phase is just simply figuring out if you submitted everything. So at the very, very least, you want to make sure you read this application very, very clearly and make sure that you provide any information that they're asking for. Next question is, why do you think there will be lawsuits? I mentioned the lawsuits, so I'll take a first shot at that. Pretty much the first round of applications were followed by lawsuits. This Pigford round was followed by lawsuits. I would say pretty much every state that I've done applications in have been followed by lawsuits. Now, sometimes those lawsuits put an injunction on those licensees actually operating. Back in the 2015 round, they did not do that, right? So they issued a handful of licenses in that 2015 round, and then there were lawsuits, but they allowed those 5 to go ahead and operate. My best guess, and this is just a guess, and I talked to a lot of people throughout the state. What it sounds like is likely going to happen is they will issue a notice of award to 22 applicants, and after that there will be lawsuits, and I would imagine there will be an administrative review and maybe even a de novo review in the administrative courts that review all the applications. So my best guess is that these 22 that they provide a notice of award to will likely be held up by the lawsuits, and those lawsuits I would imagine would take anywhere from 6 to 12 months to basically get settled out, would be my guess. Darren, Amanda, anything to add on the lawsuit front?
Yeah, having gone through and experienced that firsthand as an applicant, we lost by a margin of 0.0051. So we went through administrative hearing and we won the 7th license. And I acted as a subject matter expert on other cases in the scenario of lawsuits. So I'm very familiar with it. And, Florida, to be honest with you, it's just a litigious state, right? So, in the ideal world, if you had 22 applicants, then easy, probably no lawsuits, right? But, if you look at Alabama as an example, you just had 38 applications for 5 licenses. There's likely going to be some legal action that's going to occur because, at the end of the day, people want the license. It's a high value of the license. It's a high value industry. And the state has shown a path to licensure through legal action, right? So because that has been shown and that process is followed through, it's likely that, any applicant who isn't awarded, if they have the financial adequacy to do so, they will spend the money on a legal team to go after that license if they believe they have a good, strong chance, depending on where they scored, right? So, it's just pretty common to see across the country in competitive application processes. And of course, Florida is a highly competitive application process. You're most likely going to see lawsuits.
Amanda, anything on your end?
Yeah, I was just going to mention the people that are suing are the people who lost. So if it wasn't clear, it's not that another agency or anyone's suing. It's the applicants that lost that are suing. And like Darren mentioned, because there's a standard now for this, that hey, if you sue, you'll likely get a license. I definitely anticipate seeing a lot of lawsuits filed or administrative requests for appeals as to the losing applicants.
Yeah, and to that point, there is a precedent for if you sue, you get a license in the previous rounds. And there's actually just a bill that was filed just a couple of days ago in Florida that actually part of the language in there was relating to the people who lost in the Pigford round and essentially awarding those who have a lawsuit and are within a certain amount of points from the winner there. So there's actually, a bill out there that's essentially trying to say, hey, if you do have a lawsuit, the department needs to essentially give you a license if you're within a certain amount of points. So it's a tough precedent that they've kind of created, but there's certainly precedent out there that if you sue, you could potentially get a license. Next question is, we are a multi-state provider of turnkey systems and we've held a construction license and been registered in the state for more than 5 years. Does that count even though we are not located in the state? No, it does not count. It needs to be registered in the state of Florida. So any out-of-state entity would not qualify to be an applicant for this application. Next question. You touched on real estate. What about infrastructure, greenhouse, CEA capabilities? So yeah, I mean, the real estate, when I talk about real estate and infrastructure, I'm talking about the real estate and the equipment, the greenhouses, basically the facilities you will need to essentially build this thing out. And you want to demonstrate that you've secured, once again, that's the language they use in the scoring rubric, that you've secured the necessary real estate and infrastructure. Darren or Amanda, I don't know if you have anything to add as far as like the equipment and infrastructure.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that, let's say you're a greenhouse operator, you're a current licensed nursery, registered nursery in the state of Florida. If you have that infrastructure, that's wonderful. You want to make sure there's no bank loans against it or liens against it. But outside of that, from a production standpoint, you want to make sure that you can meet the requirements of everything from, pest, fumigation, irrigation, security infrastructure, all of those nuances, if you will, to get to production and meet the state's requirement. Simply having a greenhouse, right, isn't just enough. You have to be able to demonstrate that you can produce a quality product out of that infrastructure. And if you have in the past as a, maybe a hemp operator, and you have COAs that show that you produce quality hemp that met the state's requirements, that definitely helps. But just having the infrastructure alone, that's a first step, but there's a couple benchmarks that you might need to achieve beyond that to make sure that it's the right infrastructure to produce the quality product to meet the state standards.
And anything to add on infrastructure?
No, I mean, I think you hit it. I'm just being sensitive on time. We still have a lot of questions, so I'll just wait.
Awesome. Best case scenario on time frame for approvals. Are they batching them over time? I know there was a lot of confusion in their last emergency rule they came out with. They used the word batching, and there was a lot of speculation on what they meant by that. Based on my conversations with people, what they really meant about batching was really referring just to this round. They kind of put out that emergency rule in the application so that going into the next round, they could say the next round, once we, have another 100,000 patients and they got to license another 4, they're able to just roll that application and the rules right into that next round. So my expectation is that they will be approving all 22 at the same time. I could be wrong. They could approve 7, then they could approve 5 more, and they could approve however many from there. And by the way, I keep using the word 22. They didn't explicitly say how many they will be approving. So you could imagine if there's lawsuits and time that passes and we increase the patient population, there actually could be more than 22 ultimately that they end up approving. So I just kind of wanted to make sure that was clear. As far as time frame, best case scenario, first off, they haven't even given us the window yet of when they are due. We've been hoping for that to come. I think I keep talking to lobbyists and they keep saying, oh, it should come out next week, So at this point, I'm not even going to pretend like I know, but we are hoping it comes out at least the window within the next couple weeks, and we'll likely have 90 days once they give us that window. So I would hope it comes out within the next couple weeks. Probably that the window that you would need to submit it would be in May. I would think it's probably going to take anywhere from 4 to 5 months to get these scored. I think that would actually be pretty quick movement if we were able to see that. More likely, it might even take 6 months. And then once you get those notice of award, there may be lawsuits after that, and that might stretch another 6 to 12 months from there. So very hard to say. That the state has been very, very slow in acting historically. So hard to really say. We'll move on to the next questions. I know we have very few time. How much points given to citrus preference, and can you have a citrus farmer with some ownership without a citrus factory? I don't think you can.
Well, I don't think there's points given
There's not.
specifically. Yeah, they don't even look at it when they're grading. It's just a preference.
Right. It's
Yeah,
a preference, and it only applies to juicing, right? So as an example, farmers don't apply, even packaging houses don't apply. It's really to the processing of the citrus, whether you're doing terpenes or juice or whatever the case may be. So a citrus farmer, as an example, with 100 acres of citrus is not applicable to the preference, nor is a packaging house is applicable to the preference.
And yeah, and it needs to be the entity. And what's interesting about that one is that the way the statute is currently drafted, that entity needs to actually own that citrus property. So it's not like you could go out and find a citrus property that, you know, qualifies under the citrus preference and then do some sort of a lease agreement. You need to actually, in the application, you ask to see the actual deed to show that the entity applicant actually owns that facility. Next question, can you resell the license? Yes. The important part of that is that your buyer is, a lot of states have restrictions on transfer. Florida doesn't, which is why pretty much all the licenses except for Trulieve have been, you know, flipped. But the big thing there is that the buyer is essentially assuming your representations in the application. And this is also an important point, whether you're selling the license or not. You know, the state is going to hold you to your application. You can ask for variances, but those variances need to demonstrate that it is as good or better than the representations you made in your application. So be very careful. You know, you want to draft a good application and score high, but at the same time, once you get that license, they're going to hold you to that application. If you need to make a variance, that variance needs to be just as good, if not better, than what you represented in your application. Regarding the requirement pertaining to having an existing 5-year-old business, can you just purchase an existing business and can it be in any field? Darren, you want to go?
Yeah, as long as you know, it's registered with the Florida Department of Revenue. It can be an existing business. You can purchase one. Obviously, you want to make sure it doesn't have liens, liabilities, etc. So that can be transferred. That's not a problem at all.
Next question. Can you discuss the common types of litigation that occur during the application process? It's actually not generally like during the application process, as once they issue notice of award, there will likely be administrative lawsuits filed by those who lost. And those are in administrative court, kind of different rules than, you know, normal civil court, but not going to get into all that. Why is the application fee 140? We're just kind of doing rapid fire now because, you know, I know we're low on time. We got a lot of questions. So why is the application fee $146K when the market is already legally forced to be vertically integrated? Sounds like some classist red tape to ensure only big spenders can enter the market, that all small, medium-sized businesses are priced out. Yeah, that's just what the state requires. Keep in mind, these lawsuits do make it very expensive for the department to operate. So, you know, I know a lot of people are kicking about the fees and also the renewal fee, which is, you know, over $1 million. But at the end of the day, the government needs to be able to function. And with all these lawsuits, the cost of operating the Office of Medical Marijuana is just extremely high. So that's part of the reason for these high fees. But I agree with you. It's pretty egregious. I think it's the highest of any other state. So it's quite high. Apologies if this was answered. I had to run out for 5 minutes for my dog. How early should cannabis companies choose vendors like payroll and HR providers? Will having one pre-chosen vendor on your application create odds of license approval? Amanda or Darren, you want to take that?
Yeah, you do want to reflect, you know, whether you have an HR manager, things like that in your application, or if you're going to go with a third party, you want to reflect that in your application. So now you don't have to actually hire them and start paying them. You can have a letter of intent as an example with them, but you do want to reflect those types of things in your application of how you're going to manage your HR and payroll.
And since we're running through all these questions, a good time to just reiterate, none of this is legal advice, and, you know, doesn't create any attorney-client relationship. You certainly should be working with attorneys, consultants, whomever, people who are very experienced doing this stuff. We're just trying to give this information to the C-Lab members, so we're just kind of running through quickly. All these questions have conditions and caveats, but we're kind of just giving the short answers. Will you lose points if you show adequate financial backing to operate but are not part of the audited financials for the entity applying? Investors are hesitant to move funds prior to approval. Totally understand. I don't have the answer there. Certainly it looks better if there's cash in the bank account, but at the same time, I do understand that not easy for an investor to move capital into a bank account prior to you being awarded. I don't have the answer to that, though. I don't know if Darren or Amanda, you have any feedback on that?
I mean, I think that's right. It's better to have it in the bank account, but I also think like there's certain financial documents that are stronger than others. So for instance, if you mentioned the line of credit, if you actually have an executed line of credit that you could draw on today versus like a letter of intent that they'll put up the funds, showing that there's documentation securing the funds will help as well. Ideally, of course, in the bank account's better, but.
Yeah. Do you have something, Darren?
No, same, spot on.
All right. What advice would you give to your younger self regarding the Florida cannabis industry and how to best navigate it in the next 5 years? I don't know, it's a tough question. It's been a very, very tough industry. We're service providers, we're law firms, so we haven't been, subject to some of the capital market conditions. I do also have an investment fund. So my investment fund has certainly been very close to some of the capital market issues. And the capital markets right now in the cannabis industry are absolutely horrible. Very, very, very hard to raise capital, even for fully operational big facilities. Valuations are very extremely depressed. It's a very, very tough time for a lot of these bigger MSOs, but I think that makes it a really interesting opportunity for some of the smaller players to kind of enter the space. And also I think a lot of investors were speculating on federal changes in the law. The biggest one being 280E, which is the tax provision that only allows you to deduct cost of goods sold. And when those changes weren't made, there's been several bills that have passed the House, but not the Senate. And when those bills, did not make it all the way through, I think a lot of investors got very frustrated. So when the federal government, if the banking thing, I think gets overhyped, really the 280E is the bigger issue. If the federal government ever makes changes on 280E, I think that would just be huge for the capital markets for cannabis. In your opinion, when will the clock start on the second cycle license applicants? Anyone want to jump in there?
Unfortunately, I do not have a crystal ball. Definitely not a psychic. Hoping that they will, we're hoping it may, that it would maybe, first you're going to see them come out and say when the window is, and that hopefully will be 30 or 60 days out from when that 5-day window starts. So we haven't gotten that notice yet, and we're at the end of January. If it comes February or March, that puts us into April or May. That's my best guess, but again, I don't have a crystal ball. It's really just a guess.
Yeah, my guess is that they'll give us 90 days from when they come out with it. And, hopefully we find out within the next week, which would kind of put us into May. So that would be my best guess. Next question is there any information on consumption lounges or guesses on when this type of business will become available? They will not have consumption lounges until we actually have recreational. So there's currently a bill. I think Trulieve has put either 15 or 20 million into it so far. So it's not a bill, an initiative for recreational adult use. So I actually expect it to be on the ballot in 2024. Like I said, Trulieve has already put in, 15 to 20 million, and I think they're going to continue putting capital into it. And once recreational passes, there will need to be drafted a statute pursuant to that initiative. And hopefully that statute includes consumption lounges. So, I would say if we get it on the ballot in 2024, it's going to take time for regulations to pass, for them to license people. So I wouldn't imagine there's any consumption lounges in Florida until 2026, maybe at the earliest. Is application fee non-refundable even though application is denied? Answer to that is yes. You pay $146,000. If you lose, you do not get that money back. Next question is approximately how many applications are expected? How much of a point spread between the 22 licenses that will be awarded? As you could tell, it's very, very expensive to apply, right? So, these licenses presumably will have a lot of value, but not a lot of people are willing to spend, $500K to $1 million in rolling the dice on these applications. So my best guess, I actually think there's going to be less than people expect. I think there's maybe going to be like 100 applications. I don't know, there's not going to be like thousands of applications. It's just too expensive. But I would say anywhere between 75 to 200 applications would be my best guess. Darren, Amanda, I don't know if you have anything to add on that.
I think 200 is a pretty high watermark. I think, probably even as low as 50, but 50 to 75 is kind of what I'm estimating based off all the conversations I've had and people have contacted me about it.
Yeah. Are applications available online? Well, you don't file it online, but the document is available somewhere online. Happy to send it to you. Feel free to send me an email. Also, how soon will applications start? We already kind of answered that. Next question from Lola. I'd rather spend the money on filing a lawsuit. Do you guys recommend a firm? Happy to talk about that on the side. It's not, you can't file a lawsuit if you didn't apply. You won't have standing. So you need to apply, be a loser, then file a lawsuit. There's some great firms that have already represented different companies. We have good relationships with the law firms that have filed some of the lawsuits in the previous rounds. We do not, my law firm does not do administrative litigation, but we know plenty of attorneys that do. Next question. What is the approximate costs and expenses to complete and submit the application? Really depends. You know, some people we're talking to already they own real estate. They have the real estate all set up and ready to go. And they basically just need someone to draft an application and build a team. But I would budget anywhere between 500K to $1 million to really draft a competitive application. Darren, Amanda, would you guys agree?
Yeah, 100%.
100%. Yeah, absolutely.
Do you have to identify just one laboratory for testing, or can you pick more than one? I actually don't believe you actually have to identify even one laboratory for testing. Certainly, it could be a good idea to have some sort of an LOI with a testing lab to demonstrate that you're going to be getting everything tested properly pursuant to the statute and the rules. But I don't believe you need to identify even one laboratory. So if you want to identify one or two or three, I think that's totally fine. Darren, Amanda, anything to add on that?
I think it's important to understand that your production is going to tie to your laboratory fees. So you might want to reflect that in your financials to understand the cost of testing to bring product to market. If you don't reflect it, then you're obviously not capturing that data and that information. So to reach out to those labs and get those costs is probably a smart thing to do to be able to reflect it appropriately.
And additionally, you want to set up a great relationship with some labs because, you know, the testing in Florida, it can get really backed up. So it's important, one, that you find a lab that knows what they're doing, and two, that you have a good working relationship so they can process and perform your testing in a timely manner.
Yeah,
and shout out to ACS Laboratories. Yeah. We love them over there.
Yes, that question was asked by Masha, who works with ACS. Green Scientific Labs is also a good one. Kaisha Labs, they're great. So several labs in the state that you could work with. When will the application window open and for how long? We already answered that. The application window is 5 days. We don't know when it's going to be open. The application states phases in the scoring process. What does this mean? Essentially, if you think about, receiving 100 applications, there needs to be some process there. So I think I don't know the phases perfectly, but I think the first phase is simply ensuring that you have everything that's required in there. So just make sure you have everything required. I think the second phase is essentially like the scoring. And then I think the third phase, they're basically weighting the scoring. Darren, Amanda, I don't know if you have anything to add on those phases.
No, you hit it pretty much spot on. First phase is just making sure you hit the minimum requirements, right? And there's no things that need to be corrected, and the state will give you, depending on what it is, give you an opportunity to correct. The third is just the scoring of your, how qualified you are. And yeah, the third is just the weighted and getting your weighted averages to see who the winners are based off A, B, C, D, E.
Well, we made it through all the questions. So Darren, Amanda, you want to just say if anyone wanted to get in contact with you, Darren, any kind of shout outs, information you want to share with the group in case anyone wants to get in contact?
Sure. You can contact me at dpotter, DPOTTER at arborcan, ARBORCANN.com. We build facilities all over the country, greenhouses, indoor. We help people get the right infrastructure in place for specific crop production. So feel free to reach out.
Yeah, and Amanda and me could be reached at info@mrcannabislaw.com. That's info at mrcannabislaw.com. So really appreciate everyone attending. Y'all had really good questions, and hopefully we could do more of these with the Cannabis Lab group as things progress. Maybe once they actually announce when they're actually doing the window, perhaps we'll have another one. So we'll have to talk to Robert about that one. But thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.
Thanks, Dustin. Thanks, Amanda. Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.